We've had a couple actors in X-rated movies before, but this is the first time we've had a Playboy model on the show. Hello, and welcome to the 28th installment of Frasier Fridays, where all the salads are tossed and all the eggs are scrambled. Today, we're looking at the 4th episode of Season 2, entitled Flower Child. This episode originally aired on October 11th, 1994, and continued the trend we've seen all season thus far of having production codes out of order. This week, we have production code 205. We won't actually see production codes in order this season until the double episodes 8 and 9. Flower Child pulled in 23.4 million viewers, a climb of 1 million viewers from the previous week, and well above the season average. This actually ended up being the 5th highest rated episode of the season. At the same time, the 4th James Burrows directed episode of Friends was up 200,000 viewers this week, while Seinfeld stood out as being down again this week, falling to 29.2 million viewers. That's still more than enough to best Frasier by nearly 6 million viewers, but it is interesting that it's been in a steady decline since it returned with such high ratings for this season. In addition to directing his 4th episode in a row of Friends, James Burrows also directed this episode of Frasier. He'll direct around half the remaining episodes of this season, then a mere 5 episodes between seasons 3 and 4, before moving his direction efforts onto new series. On the writing front, we have Christopher Lloyd returning for his 3rd of 18 Frasier episodes. His 2 prior episodes, I Hate Frasier Crane and Miracle on 3rd or 4th Street, were both okay, but not exceptional. This episode is a lot stronger than his prior 2 outings, and a lot more over the top and ridiculous. This week we have the return of the Lights All Over the City intro. This is its first appearance in Season 2, and its 6th appearance overall. We've now seen the return of 2 out of 4 of our intros from the first season. We're still missing out on the elevator and the Space Needle, and the Nothing Happening intro. Moving into the episode, we're starting out with a guest caller this week, and she's an interesting one. We've had a couple actors in X-rated movies before, but this is the first time we've had a Playboy model on the show. Academy Award nominee Amy Madigan has had quite a career. She started out in the 1970s as a singer for the 3-piece pop band Jelly. This is actually what led to her appearance in Playboy, where she covered herself in jelly and posed, well, you know, how women tend to pose in Playboy, to help promote her band. I'm not sure how well this stunt worked out, because by the 1980s, she transitioned out of music and started an acting career. She landed her first role in 1981 on an episode of Heart to Heart. From there, she's made a number of movies and television appearances, including Uncle Buck, The Dark Half, a starring role in Carnival, ER, Law and Order, How to Get Away with Murder, and Penny Dreadful, City of Angels. She landed an Academy Award nomination for her role in Twice in a Lifetime, and has also starred in a number of theatrical productions. In 1983, she married fellow actor Ed Harris. There's been a number of scenes during Frasier's radio show where he doesn't exactly give good advice. One could make the argument that happens again here, but it's a little bit different. Instead of giving arguably bad advice, Frasier gives man advice, which Roz makes horrible faces about and quickly contradicts. It's a fun battle of the sexes, and not something we've got to see a whole lot of on the show. I like the dichotomy between Frasier and Roz here, and it's a great use of Roz's character. Immediately following this, we get behavior that I wasn't expecting out of Roz, where we see her acting as not only Frasier's producer, but kind of like his secretary. She lets him know a whole lot of what's going on, including dropping off a ridiculous bunny card for a KACL employee we've never met before named Clarence. We'll see more on Clarence later, but I just want to point out how ridiculous the card is. Giant novelty greeting cards still exist today, but it's a really weird choice for the studio to make, even given the bait and switch they have at the end of the episode regarding what it's for. While Frasier is signing the card, he's grumbling about how he has to always be the witty one and comments he can just taste the frozen Sara Lee cake. This is one of those references that is sort of dated and has the potential to feel a lot more dated over the next 10 years or so. Sara Lee was a food company founded in 1939. During the course of its professional development, it acquired or created a number of recognizable brands, including Jimmy Dean and Ballpark Franks. In 2012, the company was rebranded as Hillshire, and in 2014 it was sold to Tyson Foods, before being sold again in 2018 to Kohlberg & Company. Kohlberg is still producing Sara Lee branded food today, but when a brand begins to bounce around that much, its future often becomes somewhat more in doubt, and different products frequently end up being dropped. In the next 10 to 15 years, it will be very interesting to see where the Sara Lee brand is, assuming it's still around. We cut to the Cranes riding in a cab because Frasier's car broke down. This brings us to our next guest star, who is billed as a very special guest star, the pregnant cab driver, Arlene, played by Charlene Woodard. Woodard began her acting career in 1976, on stage with a Rogue Company production of Don't Bother Me, I Can't Cope. The next year, she made her Broadway debut in the revival of Hair, and the following year after that, she landed her first television role in the TV movie Cindy, a race-swapped reimagining of Cinderella, of which she starred in. From there, she's continued to act on stage and screen, including recurring roles on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and Days of Our Lives, and one-off appearances on Taxi, more on that later, The Crucible, Bones, and The Blacklist. She's a prolific and solid actress, and it's really cool to see her in such an early role here. The action starts from there, where the pregnant Arlene says her water just burst and she's going to have to give birth to her baby in the cab. A nice mirroring to Frederick's birth back in Cheers, which happened off screen. While she is giving birth to the baby, we get to see how each member of the Crane family approaches the situation, and it ends up being Martin who successfully delivers the baby. This is a really fun back and forth, and a great showcasing of how each member of the Crane family behaves. Martin calls for help on the radio and says their cab number is 804. This is actually a reference to the two-part Season 1 James Burrows directed episodes of Taxi, entitled Memories of Cab 804, where the drivers recount the wild customers they've had while driving Cab 804. It's a really cool line, and maybe the coolest Easter egg we've seen thus far in the series. One other interesting and very dated note we get from this scene is Niall's chief concern while Arlene is giving birth is that her broken water will ruin his catskin shoes. It's safe to assume he's referring to actual catskin shoes, which were legal in the US during 1994 when this episode aired. The idea of catskin shoes makes me a little squeamish, and I'm obviously not the only one. In 2001, the US banned the sale and trade of both dog and cat skin products in the US. That's right, much like Cuban scars, it is illegal to bring cat skin shoes into the US. Meaning in a mere 7 years after this episode aired, and before the series will end, Niall's shoes would no longer be legal. Our next scene opens on a very fun Daphne moment. We've seen a lot more of her being human and an individual this season, and this episode is no exception to that trend. Here we get to see what Daphne does when the boys aren't around, and it's pretty amusing. She doesn't get dressed in the bathroom after showering, and is wandering around the apartment with very little on. This quickly changes when the Crane family gets home unexpectedly soon. I comment frequently on both Grammer and David Hyde Pierce having excellent reaction shots, but I'm pretty sure this is the first time Daphne's had the best reaction shot of the episode. The gang settles in and tells Daphne about the events of the day. Then both Frasier and Martin reminisce about the birth of their own children. Martin comments that when Niles was born, he was reading an article about Mickey Mantle. Talk about life setting you up for a fall. This is a fun, different kind of pop culture reference from what we normally get. We had a few baseball references here and there before, but normally we get classical music or classical artist references. What Martin is talking about here is Mickey Mantle. despite being widely considered one of the all-time greats in baseball history, also had a horrible habit of injuring himself. In fact, by the end of his career, the man couldn't even swing a bat without being in so much pain he was forced down to one knee. It's really a tragic story of a baseball player's downfall, and a testament to just what kind of abuse the human body can and can't take. Daphne exits the scene ranting about how her mother is upset she hasn't given her any children yet, and wondering why Daphne doesn't think about anyone other than herself. This makes me want to see Daphne's parents at some point, although I'm much more pessimistic about that possibility than the chance that we'll meet Roz's mother someday. If you permit me my bunny trail for this week, this rant from Daphne could certainly be applied to any number of fictional stories, as it's a mothering characteristic that I'm sure has been used to death. With that said, the one that it immediately made me think of is the excellent Janet Ivanovich Stephanie Plum novels, and the relationship between Stephanie and her mother. These books tell the story of Stephanie Plum, a down-on-her-luck bounty hunter who isn't particularly good at her job. The first one was released in 1994, and thanks to its combination of comedy, action, and romance, was an instant success. And at this point, it had been around just long enough that some of Stephanie's character could certainly have been seeping into Daphne's writing here. Okay, that probably isn't the case, but I'm working my way through the series right now, and they had pretty much this exact same conversation in the 7th book, so it was an obvious, if not actually existing connection for me. All of this brings us to the main point of this episode, the flower child and Niles' desire to be a father. There are good and bad ways to do this topic. There's a fine line between being too cheesy and too sentimental, and this episode hits all those nails on the head perfectly. With Maris being perpetually absent, we don't have to worry about what her thoughts on child rearing are. What we do have to worry about is just what kind of a father Niles will be. The results are just delightful, and in an almost slapstick manner will take up most of the rest of the episode, as we see Niles attempting to take care of his flower child, and it becoming more and more abused as the week goes on. It's absolutely ridiculous in all the best ways, and left me cracking up every time a new wound appeared on the poor bag of flour. We get a quick mention of Guy, Niles' new housemate. We've yet to actually meet a member of Niles' household staff, and I'm kind of skeptical that we will, but it's interesting to note how often we get to hear and learn about the different members of the staff. Yes, we know Maris is quite rich, but it's still kind of surprising just how many household servants they have around their place. From there isn't too much else of note that happens in the episode. Much like last week's episode, all the action happens in the first half, and the second half is just the rest of the story playing out. Structurally, it's a little bit different than what would go on during most of the first season, and has made this season feel more plotline driven than character focused thus far. Also of note this week is we've clearly got both an A and B plot. The A plot being Niles' titular flower child, and the B plot is Frasier's greeting card. I haven't commented on this in a while, but Frasier has largely strayed away from doing B plot lines in the past, which has given characters larger arcs per episode, but had the effect of keeping the other characters extremely muted when they aren't the center of the episode. For the most part, I prefer it when we get B plots, and combined with the sheer ridiculousness and slapsticky nature of Niles' flower child, this feels like a very Cheers-style Frasier episode in all the best ways. We get another good shot at a newspaper here, and this time I was successfully able to locate the article we can see Martin reading. The headline reads, "The Long View Down, 0 and 35. This article was written by Owen Canfield and was an AP piece run by the Seattle Times on August 21st, 1994, and is about the Prairie View A&M football team, which at this point in time had lost 35 games in a row. You can view the article today on the Seattle Times archives, and it shows us exactly around what time this episode was filmed. Considering it aired in early October, and was filmed sometime in late August based on the date of this paper, it gives us a nice timeline on production and is a cool tidbit to take note of. We get a few more shots of Niles abusing the heck out of the flower child, which has somehow gone from being a nice bag of flour to resembling Martin's chair. Ultimately, Niles leaves the room, and Eddie murders the baby. Daphne says, "That dingo's got your baby," with a slight Australian accent. My immediate reaction to this is that it's a reference to Oz's band, Dingoes Ate My Baby, from the early seasons of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Obviously, that's not the actual case, as Buffy won't air for a few years yet. This is actually a reference to the 1980 death of 2-month-old Azaria Chamberlain. The story is pretty sad, and involved the parents being accused and actually convicted of murdering their 2-month-old daughter, who they claimed was taken by a dingo while on a camping trip. Later evidence confirmed the baby was, in fact, murdered by a dingo, and as of 2012, the general consensus is on the parents' versions of events. Tragically, the mother spent more than 3 years in jail on the murder conviction. The expression, "dingoes ate my baby," has been used in popular culture numerous times since then, including in the aforementioned Buffy the Vampire Slayer and a Season 3 episode of Seinfeld. Niles ultimately decides he's not ready to be a father yet, but with fear of his, and more importantly, Maris's biological clock ticking, he mentions freezing Maris's eggs. Although the technology has been around since the 1950s, with the first sperm being frozen in 1953, and the first eggs being successfully frozen 25 years later, in the late 70s, there wasn't actually a successful pregnancy from frozen eggs until 1986, less than 10 years before this episode aired, and it still wouldn't become what was considered a common procedure until sometime around 2012. Much like Niles' cell phone, it's an interesting thing that would have been available to people of wealth at the time of this episode's air date, but was still a relatively new technology and not something that was very common or even attainable for the average person. With Niles' personal revelation out of the way, Frasier's B-plot wraps up at the hospital, where he meets Clarence, the security guard, and his wife Mary. Clarence is played by Aaron Heyman, who had a minor acting career from 1987 until his death in 1995. He had 10 TV appearances and 1 movie appearance, which included a guest spot on The Nanny, Murder, She Wrote, Driving Me Crazy, and CBS Summer Playhouse. His wife Mary is played by Linda Porter, who prior to this appearance was just starting out her acting career, with only a handful of appearances prior to this, starting with a spot on Beauty and the Beast. From there, she'd go on to appear in Murder, She Wrote, Wings, ER, Clueless, Dude, Where's My Car?, Malcolm in the Middle, Scrubs, My Name is Earl, and numerous other sitcoms throughout the 90s and 2000s. Prior to her death in 2019, she appeared in 3 episodes of the Twin Peaks revival and was a regular on the comedy series Superstore. There's 2 other blink and you miss them guest stars I want to touch on real quickly. The first is the mother Niles talks to in the coffee shop, which of note is contained to the back half of Cafe Nervosa this week because of all the extra sets we're using here. This young mother is played by Robin Krieger. At first glance, she's just doing a small background role here with a few lines, which lines up with most of the other character spots she's done, including roles on Cheers, Wings, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, It's All Relative, According to Jim, and Malcolm in the Middle. Interestingly, throughout nearly Frasier's entire run, she was involved as a voiceover worker for the promos each week, making this a very cool one-off appearance for one of the unsung contributors of the show. Finally, we have the patient Frasier accidentally drops a card on. He is played by Alvy Moore. This is actually one of the very last roles the man will play before his death in 1997. Without getting too much into his career, the man has been a star since the 50s, most notably appearing as a starring role in Green Acres, and has over 150 credits to his name. I don't have the time to give him the recognition he deserves, but it's crazy to have such a huge star from the 60s TV screen playing a bit role here. The coda this week is short and sweet, and unlike other parts of this episode, does feel perfectly in line with what we expect from Frasier. It's a second great character moment for Daphne here, and really shows a nice playful side of the relationship between Daphne and Martin. Frasier sports 2 ties this week, while Niles has on 3. Both of Frasier's ties this week are new. The first one is a red tie, which is by far the most common color of the tie Frasier has worn. The second tie is blue, and surprisingly, this is the very first blue tie he's worn in the series. For Niles' part, his first tie is new, while his other 2 are repeats. This brings us up to 32 different ties for Frasier and 29 for Niles, making a total of 61 different ties for the 2 brothers thus far, and 65 for the Crane family when you count Martin. This is a really strong episode of Frasier, but that's only because it plays against what you typically expect for an episode. Not only do we have one of those rare B-plots having a substantial role this week, we have some outright ridiculousness on par with Rebecca Howe's craziness at the last few seasons of Cheers. Between the Flower Child's constant abuse and Frasier's disastrous attempts to right his wrongs with the greeting card, this feels more like a later day Cheers episode than a Frasier episode, and that's not a bad thing. On the regular Frasier front, we get some great Frasierisms here as well. We have a nice opening guest caller scene that isn't enriched by the guest caller so much as it is enriched by Frasier and Roz's relationship dynamic being on full display and working very well. We also have the great dichotomy between childbirthing for the 3 male leads and a great use of our very special guest star, Charlene Woodard. Finally, despite having only a bit part in this episode, Eddie's dingo-like viciousness against the Flower Child is wonderful and hilarious. This is exactly the kind of creative destruction I like to see from Eddie. It's not something we can get away with every week, but it's something that works out really well here. If you want to see a great episode of Frasier that feels a little bit unlike Frasier, settle into Flower Child and give this 9 out of 10 episode a watch.